and bringing it to the place of human responsibility. Lewis believed that evil is vociferous. He says this in The Pilgrim's Regress, an allegorical apology for Christianity, reason, and romanticism. What does he mean, evil is vociferous? Like nuclear fission. It just proliferates and keeps getting bigger and bigger. And God, Lewis says, put a tourniquet on evil when he created hell. He said you can go this far and no further. He even writes in The Pilgrim's Regress, it is the landlord or God's last service to those who will let him do nothing better for them. Lewis says hell is the last great expression of God's love to people who will accept him on no other terms. What does he mean by that? Well, let's see if we can spell it out further. For Lewis, hell is a place for the eternally incorrigible. It is a prison where the prisoners hold the key. Lewis writes in The Problem of Pain that he believes the gates of hell are locked from the inside, and that those inside are rebels to the end. And the book of Job seems to affirm this very point of view, for it speaks of those who go down to Sheol, saying to God, depart from us, we do not even desire the knowledge of thy ways. For who's the Almighty that we should serve him? There may be a truth, Lewis writes, in saying that hell is hell, not from its own point of view, but from the heavenly point of view. We who are going to heaven are horrified by it. The people in hell long for it because they don't want God, nor do they want to yield their lives to him. It is only the damned that their fate could ever seem less than, it is only to the damned that their fate could seem less than endurable, Lewis writes in The Problem of Pain. And Lewis also, in The Great Divorce, quotes Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost, who said, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. This is incorrigibility turned into madness. This kind of rebellion requires self-justification and rationalization. Lewis writes, continued disobedience to conscience makes conscience blind. Aristotle called this akrasia, which literally means without command, and was used to speak of a person who, knowing the right thing to do, does something else and rationalizes the action, justifying it to the point of moral blindness. And we who are very morally blind may not see the place for hell in the context of a just God and a loving God. Let's see if we can spell it out further. In this regard, hell is an eternal asylum. It is a place where the central reality of the universe is denied to the point of madness. That is, that God is God and his creatures are not. Lewis writes in The Problem of Pain, a man who admits no guilt can accept no forgiveness. In his essay on Christian apologetics, Lewis says the apologist must awaken in others a sense of sin. And he indicates that the best way to do this is to begin with one's own sin and to be honest about it. Not to point out the sins of other people, but just to live in humility and security in the love of God, to know that there's forgiveness and grace. I'll see if I can give you some examples of this. Frederick Buechner says in the book Telling the Truth, the Gospel is Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale, that before the gospel could be good news, it must be bad news. Years ago, I had the privilege of speaking at Hartford College at Oxford University in an evensong service. The chaplain, Michael Chantry, invited me to do high table with the faculty. High table at Oxford University is spectacular. If you've seen the Harry Potter movies, when they're having high table and they're sitting in that dining hall and the owls are flying in and out, that's Christ Church at Oxford University. It's the most spectacular of the halls. Hartford College is not quite as spectacular, but still pretty remarkable. You've got these honey-colored stone walls, wood-paneled partway up, with huge paintings of famous benefactors like William Tyndale or John Donne the poet. The students eat at long tables that run the length of the hall, and the faculty, they sit at a table that runs perpendicular to the students' table. If the students are eating roast beef, the faculty are eating prime rib. If the students are eating steak, the faculty are eating filet mignon. Everybody comes dressed in their academic gowns. It begins with a Latin prayer. You can cut the pretense with a knife. It's not so bad if you don't take yourself pretentiously and so on, but it's very easy to get swept up into that. Chantry introduced me to the faculty as having preached at the evensong service. We sit down after the prayer, and a woman who was sitting there said to me, "Sir Jerry, why are you a Christian?" I thought she was asking, she taught history there, I thought she was asking because she wanted to know, but somebody else told me later they thought she was asking because she wanted to make me the entertainment for that night's dinner. I said to her, I'm a Christian because I'm aware of failure in my life. I'm not aware of all of it, but I'm aware of enough of it to be devastated. And I see the incongruities and I see the brokenness in my life. And I find the love of God and the forgiveness of God a compelling doctrine, and I'm deeply moved by that. And that's why I'm a Christian. She was taken back by that answer, but she said, well, I can appreciate that, but that's just not my issue. I said, well, I think I understand what you're saying. I didn't become a Christian until I was a freshman in college, and I didn't become perfect overnight. That took 2 or 3 weeks before that happened. And everybody at the table did just as you did. They busted up in laughter. And I said to her, your laughter just betrayed you. She said, what do you mean? And I said, well, you and I just met, so you don't know the specifics of my life that made that statement incongruous with reality. But either your read of history or your read of your own heart shows you nobody has it together. She said, you got me. And I said, then knowing about your own struggle, what helps you get by? She says, I have faith in humanity. I said, well, have you ever been wounded by another human being before? She said, of course. I said, have you ever wounded another human being before? She said, I suppose so. She was a little softer on herself. I said, how does the faith in humanity work then when we live in a world where we've been wounded and we've wounded others? And just then the man sitting next to her taught French. I said, how does it work for Christians? And we spent the rest of that meal talking about themes of the grace of God, the love of God, and the mercy of God. If we live in denial of the realities of our need, and we persist in this, and run the risk of persisting in it forever, we move towards something that's like an asylum. Those in hell are diminished by the fact that they have denied reality of themselves and the grace of God as well. Lewis writes that a damned soul is nearly nothing. It is shrunk up, shut up inside of itself. Good beats down upon the damned incessantly as sound waves beat on the ears of the deaf, but they cannot receive it. Their fists are clenched, their eyes fast shut. First they will not, in the end they cannot open their hands for gifts or their mouths for food or their eyes to see. And every Christian worth his salt should have his or her heart broken over this, should engage in prayer for people who are caught in this kind of delusion, and be insistent on proclaiming the gospel to them, just like somebody did with us. And we broke out of our own delusions and finally came to faith. Lewis writes, to be a complete man means to have the passions obedient to the will, and the will offered to God. To have been a man, to be an ex-man, or a damned ghost, would presumably mean to consist of a will utterly centered in itself and passions utterly uncontrolled by the will. If you look at Lewis's villains, all of his villains are subjectivists. They lose their humanity. Weston in the Space Trilogy, Lewis's science fiction books, he's probably the worst of all of Lewis's evil characters. I think he even trumps Jadis, Queen of Charn, the White Witch of Narnia. Lewis starts calling him the unman. He has denied reality, and there's been the abolition of man. He's utterly self-referential and utilitarian. You also have Jadis, Queen of Charn, as another example of a subjectivist, self-referential and utilitarian. Her whole world in Charn mounts up against her because of all of her evil. And there's a big civil war, her against the world. And by magical art, she's learned how to say the deplorable word that will destroy her world and save herself. And she speaks a deplorable word, and in that moment becomes anti-Aslan, or anti-Christ, who, by contrast, gives of himself to save that world. Lewis's imaginative depiction of diminishment and loss of humanity in hell is most dramatically portrayed in The Great Divorce. There's one particular, in this particular book, Lewis finds himself on his way. He finds himself in hell, and he's given an opportunity to take a bus up to heaven. George MacDonald comes out of heaven, and it's sort of a satirical divine comedy. George MacDonald is Lewis's Virgil to take him through the sort of inferno and purgatorio of that world in the hopes that maybe he'll make the choice to go on into the Paradiso. But in this particular book, Lewis meets one particular ghost who comes up from hell, who is a grumbler. And he says to George MacDonald, why isn't this person given a chance? They're just a grumbler. And MacDonald says to him, we don't know if she's just a grumbler or if she's simply become a grumble. If her whole humanity has been diminished. When Lewis, in this particular book, again, a character in the book, his first impression of hell when he arrives there is, I never met anyone. If heaven is further up and further in, hell is further down and further out. In the cities, everybody is fleeing from the city. And consequently, he doesn't meet anybody. Finally, he does meet some people, and he asks them a little bit about hell. And this one guy says, you know, there were some people that went out 2 million miles to find Napoleon. And Lewis says, what was Napoleon doing when they found him? And they said he was pacing back and forth saying it was Salt's fault. It was Ney's fault. It was Josephine's fault. It was Wellington's fault. Leave it to C.S. Lewis, a Brit, to make Napoleon the worst sinner in hell, but nevertheless. The astronomical distances that we discover in hell are fabulous. But then at the end of that particular book, Lewis comes upon a diminutive man who has a string, and he's holding this alter ego, this giant tragedian actor. And we find that the real person is the diminutive man who is shrinking. And the pretense is the tragedian. And Lewis begins to see that this man's humanity is diminished the more and more he denies reality. And the pretense and the pride is enlarged, something we'll look at next lecture. By the end of this diminutive man having opportunity to choose to go into heaven, but refusing to give up his own self-interest, he finally becomes so inconsequential, he can't even hold the thread that connects him to the tragedy and alter ego. And it's at that point George MacDonald says to Lewis's character, do you see that grain of sand over there? Hell is no bigger than that grain of sand. And we think of then those astronomical distances that we were told about in the original part of the book. We see that those in hell are shrunk up till they're nearly nothing. Not nothing, but nearly nothing, because you cannot deny reality and still maintain humanity in the Lewisian conception of hell. God's punishments in Scripture are similar to this. He gives people over to what they want. He wishes they would want Him. He longs for them to want Him. He gives them the greatest gift He could give them, the gift of Himself. They were made for Him. As Augustine said, our hearts are made for Thee, O God, and they're restless until they find their rest in Thee. But if they will not have Him, He gives them what they want in His place. Pharaoh hardens his heart, and God gives him a hard heart permanently. It suggests the horrifying possibility of permanent reprobation. In Romans 1, it keeps saying God gave them over. In Leviticus 26, it says God gives them over. Hell appears to be a place where one reaps what he has sown. If you sow corn, you reap corn. You sow wheat, you reap wheat. You sow barley, you reap barley. If you sow self, you reap solitude. You reap estrangement. You reap isolation, not only from God, but from others as well. And Jesus instead says the great commandment is to love God and love neighbors. That's the tragedy. All of our lives we seem to be groping for God. We look for what only God can give in all the wrong places. And we're diminished by this. We push away the one who can satisfy our lives. The only place, Lewis says, where you can be perfectly safe from the risks of love is hell. We not only see that hell is a prison for the eternally incorrigible and an eternal asylum, but it's also fortified, and it's a fortified and frustrated assault on the purposes of God.